Okay, we are recording. Welcome to this Monday plenary. I hope that you're all well and ready this week to switch to another very important philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Have any of you heard of Kant before? K-A-N-T. Has anyone heard his name mentioned? Or is this the first time? Let me open the chat room, see what you're saying. Yeah, some of you have. Okay, well, that's fine. He's quite a difficult philosopher. The good news is that we're going to look at it's actually arguably the simplest part of his philosophy. He's a great rationalist and very important one. He's a modern philosopher of the Enlightenment period. And he also gave us a really interesting moral theory, which is our context, as you know, in this section. And once again, his moral theory is going to differ significantly from Plato's, Aristotle's, and Hobbes's. So we're fast forwarding now to the end of the 18th century to look at Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. The extract in your textbook is the one we'll basically look at, but you can find all kinds of other extracts if you're not using that book. And I also want to lead up to Kant with something else this morning, because his moral theory is posed partly in response to something that was earlier proposed by David Hume, whom we haven't encountered. I'll just type his name in. He's also a very important philosopher. We're not going to cover him this term, except in passing today. He's a British empiricist. Not at all, I'm sorry, Hume is H-U-M-E. He's a British empiricist, not at all like Berkeley, different, but belonging to the same family. And Hume, one of the things for which David Hume is very well known is what we would call moral skepticism. This is really, in a sense, a follow-up from Hobbes. And I'll share a reading with you momentarily, just some data on Hume. And we'll go through, in very brief, something called Hume's Guillotine, which poses a really kind of insuperable problem to us in terms of how to make moral derivations or how to construct moral arguments. Hume's going to show us something in the 18th century that no one had yet thought of, although Hobbes declared certainly that all of our likes and dislikes were entirely subjective, and so our moral propositions were also going to be subjective, and Hume doesn't disagree with that. But he's going to show us even more emphatically that our moral derivations, in some logical sense, are condemned from the very beginning to be subjective. And that position has come to be called moral skepticism. And it's Kant who's desperate, really, to provide an answer to Hume. Kant is not happy. He's a rationalist in the tradition of Plato and Descartes. There are many rationalists in philosophy. Kant's one of the greatest. Maybe some would say the greatest since Plato. And Kant is very unhappy about this idea of moral skepticism, particularly as presented by Hume. So this morning, what I want to do is to have a quick look at Hume's problem. It's sometimes called Hume's guillotine. And then once we will have looked at the problem Hume bequeaths to us, then we are going to look at Kant's answer to it. So Kant's moral theory can be studied all on its own, but I just wanted to contextualize it in that way. So it might be interesting for you to see really partly who he's responding to. And then we'll focus mostly today and in my breakout group, and presumably the rest of you also with your instructors, on how do we apply Kant's so-called categorical imperative. He leaves us with a very important principle. All right, so that's our agenda this morning, to look quickly at Hume and understand Hume's moral skepticism, and then to begin to assess how Kant is going to respond to this and try to restore to our ethical arguments and our ethical deductions some kind of objectivity and some kind of lawfulness. It's really quite an extraordinary contribution that he made, whether you agree with Kant or not. And at the end of the day, I think you'll be bound to admit that his contribution is really interesting and unique. Like most of the ethics we've studied so far from these historically important ethicists, each one is giving us quite a unique perspective, right? Okay, is that fair enough? Everybody with it this morning? Are we all set to go? Okay, nobody's objecting. I'm assuming you're all happy and ready to go. One more thing I want to say to you about this week and next week. Do you remember, and please do respond in the chat room, do you recall at the very beginning of this course, I think it was in the first plenary, I hope it was, that I mentioned to you the rule of thumb about spending at least an hour reading and thinking outside of class for every hour we spend together. Does anybody recall that rule of thumb? Good. All right. Some of you are saying yes, many of you. All right. Well, I'm very glad to hear that this idea has embedded itself in your consciousness, and particularly as we're going up a steeper part of the learning curve now. We digested a lot of Hobbes last week. Really, we covered quite a lot of ground, but Hobbes is a clear writer and very straightforward. Whether you agree or disagree with him, he's not difficult to understand, but does require some extra reading, and I hope you've been doing it. Kant is more difficult because of his writing style in German, which was quite obscure. The way he wrote was not simple, and then translated into English, it's not simpler. So don't be dismayed if indeed you're reading a passage of Kant from our textbook, you read a paragraph and you don't understand in the least what he's talking about. That's normal for philosophy. Not because we try to write like this, but some of us are thinking thoughts which are not immediately graspable the first time around. So you must treat it as normal. If you have to read even a sentence of Kant 2 or 3 or 5 times to begin to make sense of it, don't worry. It's not nothing wrong with you. This is how sometimes philosophers have to proceed. It takes us a while at times to understand what another philosopher is trying to say. So you may have to read him several times. And again, you can consult other resources that as many of you have been doing in your essays, at least the ones I've seen. You've been doing some good research and making use of the myriad resources online, okay? So there are a lot of different explanations of Kant. Just be mindful that you need to put in the time. And it will be well spent if you want to understand him. And also next week, Mill, who's easier to understand for sure, but also will entail a lot more reading, because to give you a complete overview of Mill in 2 lectures is not easy. His ethics are central to his whole position, but we'll need to tackle 3 different texts in order really to look at him in a balanced way, okay? So just get ready to do some extra reading. Or at least to do the amount of reading that I prescribed to you at the beginning, which may not be extra for some of you at all, all right? And the effort will be, I'm sure, well worth it. Okay, so without further ado then, let's look at Hume's moral skepticism and see, therefore, the problem that Kant is going to try to tackle, all right? If you have questions, of course, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. First, I want to share a screen with you, of course, and I'm going to endeavor to do that now. If I can come up with the screen, let's see if the sharing is going to cooperate this morning. Looks like it might. Okay, so I'm now sharing something. Well, it doesn't look like it's sharing. Yes, it is. Now it is. You see the is-ought problem? Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Thank you very much. All right. So that's a picture of David Hume, and it's called the is-ought problem because what Hume is really going to tell us in a nutshell is that you cannot derive ought from is. So when we make is statements, we're making descriptive statements about the world, right? Like today is Monday. That's a descriptive claim. Or the sky is cloudy. It's a descriptive claim. And we use this copulative verb to be, is, are, was, were, will be, and so forth. Descriptive statements are often couched in that kind of language, yes, using is. All right, so the apple is red, yeah, and so forth. So that's called is. And when we make normative claims, remember, moral claims about what we ought to do or should do, these are very different kinds of claims because of the grammar and what's behind the grammar, which is the semantics. And what Hume would say is actually the epistemology. Ought is very different from is. And so what's become known as Hume's guillotine is what severs for once and for all the possibility of deriving ought from is. So Hume is telling us in a nutshell on this page, and I got this from Wikipedia, is that you can never derive ought from is. You have to derive ought from from some prior ought. You may, in fact, use is in your derivation, but from a certain state of affairs, it's never unambiguously or logically clear how we could possibly derive a normative claim from a descriptive one. That's the general statement. I'm going to give you several examples in the next few minutes. So please digest this. And this is in Hume's words. Hume is writing in a very flowery Baroque way, 1739 is the High Baroque. He writes in long sentences, but please understand what he's saying. In every system of morality, which I've hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning and establishes the being of a God or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. And he goes on to say this change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence, meaning very important. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given. For what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention, what he's calling a small attention is a British understatement, it's a huge thing, would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality, and let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason. That's one of the most important paragraphs ever written in Western moral theory, because he's telling us you basically cannot derive ought from is. It never follows. So this is the explanation of it in Wikipedia. The apparent gap between is and ought is called Hume's guillotine. And there's the link. Okay, let me give you a quick example, and then I'll take some questions, all right? So I'll stop the share for a moment, and then we'll come back to it. Here's a quick example. Suppose we say that Jones is a convicted serial killer. All right, that's an is statement, right? Jones is a convicted serial killer, all right? So what kind of an ought would we want in, let's say, in legal ethics, what kind of an ought might we derive from that? If we're confronted with this is statement that Jones is a convicted serial killer, we might want to say, well, Jones ought to be, in some states, the prosecutor would say Jones ought to receive the death penalty, right? And in other states, there is no death penalty. It's been abolished. So the prosecutor would likely say Jones ought to receive a number of consecutive life sentences, like sentence him to 800 years, or whatever in prison, right? Even though he's not going to live to the 100, we'll give him 800 years for good measure. So those are two different oughts, yeah? One ought is that he ought to be put to death by the state. The other ought is that he ought to serve 800 years in prison. But do you see that both oughts are coming from the same is? All right, we're saying Jones is let's say a convicted serial killer, all right? So that's an is. That's what Hume's calling an is statement. It's a descriptive statement about a certain state of affairs. Now, what kind of an ought can you derive from that? You could derive many kinds of oughts from that. Yeah? Do you get this? Yes? Anybody? Do you begin to see that there's no unequivocal ought? There's no one unique ought. You don't get it. Okay, I'll say it again. It is the case, we'll suppose, that Jones is a convicted serial killer. We're saying that's an is statement, right? It is the case that Jones, or Smith, or whoever. So what ought we do? My question to you, what ought we to do? What should we do? What should we do with a convicted serial killer? Well, put him in prison. In other words, we have to formulate an ought, right? We ought to put him in prison, right? Yes? Okay. Okay, you got it now. Yeah, we ought to do something, yes? And the criminal justice system, depending which state you're in, will give you different oughts. Some will say you ought to give him as many life sentences as he deserves for how many people he killed. Some will say if he's a convicted serial killer, he ought to be put to death. And some states will do that, and other states will put him in prison. So that's two very different two very different moral prescriptions. That's two very different moral prescriptions being derived from the same state of affairs, from the same is. Is this clear now? Yeah, so one is a fact. That's right, Taisha. One is a fact, what we call a fact, and is a descriptive statement, okay? In our technical terminology, it's a descriptive statement about a certain fact, if you like. And one is flexible in action, meaning one is a moral conclusion. In our context, one is a moral conclusion that we're trying to derive from a certain state of affairs. And Hume's point is that depending on a whole bunch of other background assumptions that are not being stated but are in play, we're going to be able to derive very different kinds of ought statements from a particular is. Okay, so Ahmed says, depending on the nature of his crimes, he ought to be rehabilitated. There you go. I'm saying he's a serial killer to make it more believable that he's not rehabilitatable, but you could say he ought to be rehabilitated if there's some way, or sentenced to life or given. Right, we can't decide what we ought to do. Well, we will know in a trial, Ahmed, you know the nature of his crimes because the prosecution, if he's convicted, the prosecution has established beyond a reasonable doubt that something is the case about this guy, okay? For the sake of argument. That's what it means to be convicted. You convince a jury that, so-and-so is presumably guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And then they have to decide, or the judge has to decide what ought to be done with the sentencing. And all Hume is saying is that there is no unequivocal logical way to derive ought from is. We've already seen there are many different possibilities of what ought to be done. And I'm making this a dramatic case, but it could be the case just in daily life that there is a certain state of affairs. Like, okay, your best friend lied to you about something, okay? We'll make it a much more benign, and simple situation. Oh, you found out that your best friend deceived you. It is the case that your best friend told you a lie about something. What ought you do? What should you do? Once again, there are a number of different responses you could make, right? Okay? Do you understand the point? That you ought to try to, to understand what happened, or you ought to be angry, or you ought to be forgiving, or you ought to be a bunch of things. Yeah. So what you ought to do is not clear from the facts of the matter at all. And what Hume is saying is that how we derive an ought is we need two things. We need an is, whatever the fact of the matter is, and then we need another ought that's already in play. We need an ought that's already implicit in the context of the facts. And then we'll use an is plus an ought, and then we'll eventually derive another ought. So in the example of a serial killer, if you're in a state which has the death penalty, then what's already known is that, let's say Smith is a convicted serial killer, and the state says that convicted serial killers ought to get the death penalty, and therefore you can indeed validly conclude that Smith ought to get the death penalty. But you understand that conclusion does not come from is alone. It comes from an is and a prior ought. Okay? Now let's say we're in a different state, and a state that doesn't have the death penalty. And so we have the same is, that Smith is a convicted serial killer, but let's say the state says that such people ought to serve consecutive life terms for every life they've taken. And so the implicit ought premise is now that Smith ought to serve consecutive life. The conclusion, is that Smith ought to serve consecutive life terms. And that comes from the same is, but from a different implicit ought. And so what Hume is telling us is that we can only derive ought from a prior ought, along with whatever is the matter of fact. But we can never derive ought from is alone. And so oughts are going to be very flexible. What oughts we assume are going to be very flexible. There's going to be no single ought or solitary ought, which is going to dictate universally what all the other oughts ought to be. And that's what we're stuck with. That's the position of moral skepticism, that these oughts are inevitably subjective. Whatever oughts you take to be the operative oughts or the most important oughts are going to be the ones, as Hobbes said, that you like. All right. So that's the connection between Hume and Hobbes. And so I'm not trying to depress you or demoralize you this morning. I'm just trying to point out to you this is a formidable problem, because it tells us that reason is going to be incapacitated in a certain way if we're trying to use our rational minds to derive a moral conclusion from a state of affairs. We're always going to need at least one more ought in the argument. And the ought that we choose to insert in that argument is an ought that we subjectively prefer. And so that is the position of moral skepticism. Okay. And if you get this, fine. If you need to think about this more carefully, then you should read up on Hume, and you can look at that encyclopedia extract from Wikipedia, or indeed any other extract about Hume's moral theory. I will give you a couple of other examples, though, before we move to Kant, okay? Because I want you to realize that this is what Kant is trying to do for us. He's trying to resolve Hume's guillotine. He's trying to show us that actually Hume is wrong, and that we can use our rational minds in order to know what to do in a given situation, what we ought to do from a state of affairs. That's Kant's project. A very difficult and challenging problem, and not everyone agrees with his solution, needless to say. But before we get to Kant, I thought it would be useful for you and thought-provoking for you to be aware of Hume's guillotine, which is why I presented it. Let's look at one more case from Hume, and or several. Actually, I concocted a few examples. You know, it's like one of these cooking shows, you know, where you prepare some of the dishes in advance, right? This is in your Google Drive folder. Ahmed, are you making a pun? You had to make a Kant pun, I know. Okay. Kant lends himself to puns too. Okay, so let's try and share the screen once more. The is-ought distinction. And so that's the general case we've just made. And I've concocted some other examples on this page. This is in your Google Drive folders. So here's some examples to illustrate more clearly. Okay, let's say example one as an is statement, that unfortunately it is the case that thousands of children in the world are dying every day from malnutrition. That unfortunately is well established. Thousands of children are dying, right? And is are, plural, dying every day from malnutrition. Well, one conclusion is what? What could we say we ought to do? Well, we ought to make greater efforts to feed them. Obviously, we have enough food. It's a question of many other things being in play, but there's enough food in principle to feed everybody. So you could conclude from the is that we ought to make greater efforts to feed them. That's one conclusion. That would be perhaps a compassionate conclusion, or a concerned conclusion, right? Then again, from the same is, thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition, you could draw a much more harsher, in a way, conclusion. You could say, well, those who cannot feed their families ought not procreate. So if people have more children than they can feed, then you could make a different kind of moral argument. You could say, well, people ought not bring children into the world if they're not able to feed them. I mean, that sounds much crueler, but it's another ought, right? And it's in response to the same is. And obviously, these are two very divergent kinds of conclusions, aren't they? Because in this example, will hungry children become, in some sense, everybody's responsibility? And in the second case, hungry children become primarily, if only, the responsibility of their parents. So you see that we get two divergent oughts from the same is, right? I'm not trying to say what should be done about hungry children. I'm just illustrating to you with this tragic example that we can get very different moral prescriptions that come from the same kind of is statement. The oughts can go in divergently different directions. Is this clear? All right. I hope it's clear. And all the other examples are the same. We can talk about climate change. Our planet is undergoing climate change. All right. That's an is. Seems well established from a variety of scientific facts. And then you could say, well, here's one possible ought. What should we do, right? Okay, government should take drastic legislative action, such as imposing carbon taxes or other things. I mean, green parties have all kinds of proposals to what governments ought to do, right? Okay, but then again, we could take the same is, our planet is undergoing climate change, And you could get a different ought out of it. You could say, well, therefore, governments should carefully study all scientific findings to ascertain the precise extent of human impact on climate before making new laws. So we just rush in and make laws which may have unintended consequences and may make some things worse. So again, there are two different kinds of conclusions: moral conclusions or ought statements, normative, right, or prescriptive statements that can be derived from the same is. And obviously, we need something else in both of these arguments. We need, and there's another implicit ought. Ought is never being derived directly from is. That's Hume's point. Ought is being derived from another ought, maybe in conjunction with some is statements. So there's always another ought in there. All right. Do you get this? One more example. Some people are offended by other people's jokes. So what ought we do? Well, one line would be, therefore, any joke that offends anyone should be prohibited, and the offender should be punished. That's one argument that could be made. It is made. In fact, it's not just punished; it's canceled. Right? You should be canceled. Some people say, and some people are being canceled. On the other hand, from the same is, some people are offended by other people's jokes. So a different ought is, therefore, people should realize that they can never be offended against their will, and therefore ought to understand that their feelings are their own responsibility. Right? So that would be a very different ought, in which case there's no prohibitions and no punishments in order. Very different set of, again, divergent moral prescriptions coming from the same is statement. Okay? So this shows you that Hume, in any context you want to concoct, you'll discover that Hume is correct. We can't really unequivocally derive an ought from an is with which everyone will be in accord. What we can do is to derive a whole bunch of different oughts from the same is, but that's only going to leave us in a state of moral confusion, or indeed moral disagreement or moral conflict. Yes? And what the implication is, therefore, is that this threatens our secular ethics, because they're going to be, at the end of the day, completely subjective and arbitrary. And after all, that's what Hobbes said, right? That's what Hobbes said a century before Hume. So this is just some leaning toward moral skepticism. And if we want to have some kind of coherent moral theory, we need to find an answer to this problem, okay? And that is partly what Kant is trying to do. Are we clear about this? Shall we go on now to look at Kant? But how ought we enforce that law? Well, which law is that, Ahmed?
Was it the law that people that say jokes that offend others should be punished? Like, if everyone that says a joke that offends others should be punished, how do we track down all these people? Like, you can't enforce it.
Well, after the election, it may start, depending who wins the election, you may start seeing it, okay? Don't draw me into a political debate this morning, because I'm very easily drawn. But how are laws enforced is a totally separate question from which laws should we have, okay? I mean, law enforcement is a different issue. There are many laws which really can't be enforced very well. Another pun on Kant, but they can't be. There are some laws which are easier to enforce, and other laws which are more difficult to enforce. Okay, so that's a whole separate question. But it's another ought. I mean, we could say there is, if there were such a law. How ought we to enforce it? Well, we could bug everybody. I mean, read 1984. We have Big Brothers watching, Big Brother or Big Sister, as the case may be. If they're watching and listening to us, then they could have some kind of an offense commission. And if they record a joke which they think is offensive, then they'll be able to enforce the law by sending the police to your home. I mean, all kinds of horrific scenarios can be envisioned. And there are some countries in the world in which people have to be very careful, and ours too in some contexts. You have to be very careful about what you say, because those laws can be enforced and are enforced. Whether they're morally justified or not is a whole different argument, right? But law enforcement, yeah, it's happening in China. Of course it is. It's happening in many countries. And it's happening here too in the private sector, where companies have policies about what kind of T-shirt you're allowed to wear and not, what kind of hat you're allowed to wear and not. And you can even be refused service as a customer if the person who's serving you doesn't happen to agree with the opinion on your T-shirt. Okay, I mean, this is completely contrary to the First Amendment, but then it's back to Ahmed's question: how do we enforce how ought we to enforce the First Amendment? It's very difficult to do. If it requires enforcement, then that's what supposedly the justice system is for. I'm glad you're asking these questions. They're very practical. And I'm glad you're now thinking about the implications of Hume's guillotine. Could one, and a question has come up, could one conclude that the oughts that result in peace, happiness, largely should be the ones people follow? Ah, great question. That's for next week. When we look at John Stuart Mill and Mill's moral theory, we're going to see exactly that, the greatest happiness theory, okay? Utilitarianism is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that's how that question will be dealt with next week. So please be patient, okay? We'll get a very interesting answer to that. But Kant wants to give us a different answer. Kant, now I want to focus on Kant and give you a setup for what Kant's going to tell us. Kant is going to profess a kind of deontology. Remember, that word deontology as a family of ethics, there are many deontologies. And deon is the root word, it means duty. So in a certain sense, a deontology is a set of ethical precepts or a set of ought statements, which we have some kind of duty to obey or duty to follow. And this could be a religious or a secular duty. If we want to speak most generally, a deontology is like a rule book that's telling us what we ought to do or what we ought to refrain from doing. The most simple way to understand deontology is that it's a rule book, okay, for moral behavior. So it tells us what we ought to do or what we ought not to do. And the whole notion of deontology, again, is the notion that we have some kind of duty to obey those rules, whether our aim is a civil society or our aim is overall happiness or our aim is salvation in a religious context or avoiding damnation in a religious context. So there's always some kind of a duty that will be pinned on us either by a theological system or by a secular system to be law-abiding. And deontology is simply our duty to follow the rule book. Okay? Is this clear what deontology means? All right, everyone's good with that. Fine. So, give me an example of such a rule book from a religious context. There are many famous examples. What would be an example of a religious rule book that tells us what we ought or ought not to do? Anyone? The Bible. Yeah, specifically the Ten Commandments. Exactly, Raji. That's a very ancient Bible, Quran, Torah, all contain moral rules, all of them. The Abrahamic faiths are all very big on moral rules. They're all deontologies, partly deontologies, and they do indeed have moral rules, very, very clear moral rules. And the Ten Commandments are a really good example of that, yeah? All right. So they tell us what to do and what not to do. And they're supposedly from God, yes? Supposedly from God, so they have that authority. We also have secular rules. Any idea anyone could point to the Constitution, exactly, Hillary. That's right. Our civil codes, our Bill of Rights tells us what we're entitled to do and what the government's not entitled to do to us. Yes. The Code of Hammurabi. Yes, I was going to mention that, Ahmed. That's an ancient code, a very ancient code. I think from ancient Babylonia. About 1500 years BC, maybe that I'm not much of an historian, but it's a really ancient code and one of the first ethical codes. And Hammurabi, very famously, one of the principles in that code, I remember, is that if a builder builds a house and the house collapses, if the builder cheats on the materials, and the house collapses and kills anybody in the family, then the builder's corresponding family member will be put to death. Okay, so this is what we call retributive justice, right? An eye for an eye, as it's often but mistakenly called. But in any case, that's an ancient form of what we ought to do when things go wrong. So yeah, there are many codes, and those are all deontological. They're telling us what we ought or ought not to. Okay, so I'm glad you're able to come up with these examples. You'll notice something interesting about deontology, and I'll mention it in passing, because it's one of the problems that Kant is well aware of and also wants to circumvent. We may, and here's the problem. I mean, I like rule books, okay, and it's an advantage. Remember, I said to you very importantly that every moral system that we consider is going to have strengths and weaknesses. Remember this, everyone, there's no perfect system apparently. Everyone will have strengths undeniably, but there will also be weaknesses. So what about deontology? Well, in general, the strength of deontology is that there is a rule book to begin with. So if people want to know what is permitted or what is proscribed, then at least they can look the rules up. It's very handy. If we have rules of engagement and we're not sure about what's right or wrong, we can look at the rules and the rules will tell us to a certain point, right? Well, Taisha, every time a builder built a house in Hammurabi's period, it was not so much a gamble. I mean, houses don't go around collapsing for no reason. We're not talking about earthquakes, we're talking about normal times. But if the builder skimmed the profits, let's say the builder was corrupt and the builder charged a certain amount of money, and then he used substandard material, right? So he saved a lot of money and used substandard material, and then the house collapsed for that reason, then the builder would be responsible, just as today, only we're not going to put the builder's family members to death, but we're going to sue the builder for a lot of money. Okay, so back to this strength of deontology is that you have a rule book, so you can look up the rules. The weakness is right there. The problem is that we may agree on rules, but we have to interpret what are tolerable exceptions to the rules. And this can pose insuperable problems. Ironically, even if we have rules that we think are good and we like them, we all agree that the rules are good, we're still going to end up disagreeing about the exceptions to the rules. Every rule has exceptions. So let me give you an example. We have rules against murder, right? We have in the criminal code, we define all kinds of homicide. It's all illegal, whether it's involuntary or negligent or premeditated. It's depends on the charge, but they're all illegal acts. If you kill somebody, and you're charged with homicide, it's a crime. Okay, but what are the exceptions to these rules? Under what circumstances are we actually allowed to kill others or to take human life? What would be some exceptions to the rule? I mean, we have laws against murder, or laws against, self-defense. Exactly. But even that's not clear, right? Because from state to state, you may have different interpretations, whether you're allowed to, for example, carry a gun or not, and what force you're allowed to respond with. So, but self-defense is a defense. So it's an exception under certain circumstances. Okay. What else? Capital punishment. Exactly, Raquel. Capital punishment. So, in other words, the state says you're not allowed to kill people, and you kill people, so we're going to kill you. And this because the state has more power than the individual. So the state is allowed to kill people, but we're not. So that's an exception to the rule. What about psychologists call crimes of passion? Yes. And they generally carry less culpability, Ahmed. If you're convicted of a crime, if you're convicted of a homicide, hypothetically, but it was a crime of passion. You lost your cool in the heat of the moment. Generally the sentencing guidelines are less because it wasn't premeditated murder. It'll be reduced to a lesser charge. Still going to be some kind of homicide, but not premeditated. So that means morally you're deemed to be less culpable. Okay, war is another example, David. Exactly. So in wartime, you're not only going to be encouraged to kill, but you're going to be trained to kill and armed and paid, a salary, and promoted if you kill enough people and so forth. So what becomes a vice in civil society is indeed a virtue in international conflict. So that's another example. So what about, there's one more big one that you haven't mentioned yet. We've covered self-defense, capital punishment, war, revenge killings. Yes, in some countries, revenge killings are in fact exceptions to the rule. They are legal or at least sanctioned. Abortion is the other big one, Iris, because it depends what you deem to be a living being, right? The Roe versus Wade decision is based on the fetus having no rights until it's born. At that point, it has all rights, but before it's born, it doesn't have rights. So you could kill it right up to birth nowadays in some places. Okay, so you get the point that we probably all agree. Hopefully, we all agree that we shouldn't go around killing people, but we see all these exceptions. And what I'm trying to say to you is that every deontology, every rule book of moral behavior is going to have rules that we probably agree on, but exceptions that we probably disagree on. And that's a problem with deontologies, whether they're religious and different factions or different denominations of the same religion are different, usually because they disagree on the interpretations of the rules. They may all follow the same scripture, but they will interpret the rules differently. You get this? And so they will have certain denominations, whether they're more strict in their interpretation or whether they're more lax in their interpretation. They all claim to be belonging to the same religion, and maybe they do. But again, the exceptions to the rules will vary for them. So you see what Kant is confronted with. What's confronting him late in the 18th century are these two problems. Firstly, that Hume's guillotine needs to be resolved, and secondly, that all these rules have so many exceptions. How can we ever make sense of them? So Kant does this in one fell swoop. His brilliant rational mind and his insistence that we can use our rational minds to actually solve both of these problems allows him, in the groundwork that we're looking at in a moment, to produce something called the categorical imperative. This is what he's famous for. You don't have to know what it means now, but by the end of this lecture, you will. Categorical imperative, this is what is most often associated with Kant's moral theory. It's the maxim or the rule that he comes up with, which is actually a meta-maxim. A maxim, I'll just introduce that word, M-A-X-I-M, means a rule. Okay, means basically a rule. And Kant's categorical imperative is a meta rule. The CI, as it's often called, I'll type this in. CI stands for categorical imperative, okay, is a meta rule. It's a meta rule. It's not a rule, but it's a rule that tells us which rules we should follow. And there are no exceptions to categorical imperative. If a categorical imperative, if a given rule, if a given moral rule that we're contemplating following passes the test of the categorical imperative, then Kant says we have to follow it without exceptions. So we'll get to this, and we'll, now turn to him to see how he comes up with this rule, what this rule is. And we'll look at a few quick examples today. Next day, I'll look at his own examples with you. And then there's a second variation that we also need to discuss. But that's going to be Thursday's work and the work in our breakout groups. Today, I want to focus on the main formulation of his categorical imperative, which is going to he thinks, solve the problem of Hume's guillotine and also resolve the problem of all these exceptions to rules that we come up with. Okay, so it's a very interesting challenge. And if this categorical imperative can do both those jobs, then indeed it turns out to be a very, very powerful meta rule. And Kant's deontology is famous for this. Oh, it is strict, and Kant was very strict with himself too. He had a great life, but he basically walked the walk. And was very respected as a teacher as well. Okay, so let's have a look now at the text. I'll pull this up if I'm able. I have the reading in front of me. Just let me share it with you. I'm backpedaling through the pages. Here we go. Kantian ethics. So let's go back to the screen share, which seems to be, so far, it's been cooperating this morning. And it still is. Okay, good. So Kantian ethics, this is page 583 of my edition of your textbook, but you can find this online as well. It's a short essay. That is to say, it's about 125 pages. That's a long essay probably for you guys, but for philosophers, if we write a 100-page book, we call it an essay. All right. So it's a shortish essay for Kant, but we're not covering the whole thing in any case. As usual, I want to touch on the highlights with you. So you can read a little bit about Kant, and he's in the category of Plato and Aristotle in terms of being a very influential thinker. I would say Hobbes is also, but he's in that category. He's among the all-stars. If you want to pick an all-star team, certainly Kant will be on it. And his moral theory stands in contrast. Not only is he addressing Hume's guillotine, but he's also going to be contrasted with consequentialism and in particular utilitarianism. And when we look at that next week, you'll see how strongly he's opposed. In fact, we'll see it in a moment, that he thinks that moral theories that place emphasis on consequences are absolutely wrong and actually immoral. He thinks it's immoral to be concerned about consequences. He thinks it's only moral to be concerned with the principles that one follows. That's his rationalist and deontological approach. If you want to know what goodness is, it's one of the easier parts of the theory. He tells us right off the bat in chapter 1 that he says, I've highlighted this, it is impossible to conceive anything at all in the world or even out of it, whatever that might mean, which can be taken as good without qualification except a good will. So for Kant, what's good about a person, or what's good in general, is a good will. This is not an ethical, it is an ethical, not an aesthetic good, right? So he's not talking about what a good book is or a good meal is. He's talking only in terms of a good will. And that is the main thing. He goes on to say intelligence, wit, judgment, and other talents of the mind we may care to name are important, such as virtues too: courage, resolution, constancy of purpose, as qualities of temperament. So intellectual talents may be admirable and virtues may be admirable. He says are without doubt good and desirable in many respects. But he says, and this is the key, they can also be extremely bad and hurtful when the will is not good. So consider with yourselves that if a person who's very, let's say, very clever has bad will, then they can use that to do awful things. Yes. If a person is fearless but has bad will, then they may end up doing awful things. So he says that these other faculties, such as talents of the mind or qualities of the temperament, may be good and useful in particular cases, but if they're not animated by a good will, then they could backfire in very, very disastrous and undesirable ways. Is that clear? So goodwill has to animate those things. Otherwise, they're not much good on their own. That's why he focuses the meaning of goodness in the will itself. If a person has goodwill, said a different way, if a person has goodwill, then for Kant, they are a good person. They'll be an asset. That person will be an asset to society, regardless of what their particular intellectual talents are, regardless of what their particular qualities of temperament are. A person with goodwill is going to be a good person, no matter what they end up doing, okay? So goodness is goodwill for Kant. And then he goes on to say that power, wealth, and honor and these things are similarly not as important. And they're not going to matter to him very much at all. All right? So is it going to let me? Yeah, it's going to let me turn the page. Okay. So then he goes on to make this very important distinction, and it's one that is characteristic of deontology, that it is not going to take consequences into account as much as principles. A good will is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes, because of its fitness for attaining some proposed end. It is good through its willing alone. That is good in itself. So goodwill for Kant is the key. And it's therefore your intentions that count much more than the outcomes that you may attain. And this is Kant's deontology, and particularly emphatic. Now, I know we have a saying in English, and maybe some of you have heard it, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Nonetheless, Kant is firm on this, that if we start, in fact, he's going to say more. He thinks that if we act in accordance with attention to the outcomes that we obtain, that it's actually immoral. It's actually immoral. And because it might not be moral at all. Just because we might get a useful outcome does not mean that we committed a deed in any way that could be qualified as a moral deed. He'll give you an example over Leaf, and I'll spend a minute on it with you. But meanwhile, understand his point of view, that a good will is not good because of any consequences of one's actions, but it's good because of its will alone. The fact that we have goodness inside is what, and that it's goodness that allows us to act in a righteous way. It's our intentions, if you like, that predetermine our righteousness, and that's where our moral agency lies, and not in the outcomes. So he really will divorce this, and deontologists often divorce outcome from intent. Kant is very famous for this. And so this is the concept, again, of duty. I remember the root of deontology is the Greek word deon for duty, and includes out of a goodwill. And it's going to be exposed, he knows, to all kinds of limitations. But it's going to make the overcoming of these limitations and obstacles will actually, as he says, make the goodness of one's will shine forth more brightly, if indeed it's there to begin with. So now we're going to make a distinction between honesty and prudence. Okay, the word prudence. Does anybody know what the word prudence means? Prudence. Has anybody heard the word prudence?
I forgot the term.
Okay, you forgot it. It's perfectly okay to forget.
It means like to be like a little blunt, or just a little too straightforward.
A little blunt, not necessarily. I mean, I could see how it could be.
Is it close? Is it close to like arrogance?
No, not really. I mean, again, exercising prudence or being prudent is partly wise, maybe discreet, maybe. Prudent, cautious is more like it. I think, Taisha, cautious, maybe some of you are quick on the draw and you're Googling it, but you'll come up, prudence could be used for a lot of, in a lot of different contexts. But I think one of its most common meanings is really, in a certain sense, self-interest. Self-interest or care for the self. So if you're prudent, you won't walk out into traffic without checking the light first or oncoming traffic. It's care for the self, or self-preservation in a certain sense is prudence. Okay, it's not greed. It's not like Hobbesian self-interest to an extreme, but it's just a general self-interest, care for the self, self-preservation. Okay, cautiousness out of, you wanting to avoid a dangerous or an unsatisfactory situation. So it can mean a lot of things, but in general, the idea of being prudent could be, if one looks at your behavior, and he gives the example of a grocer here. It's a very, very good example. If one looks at a behavior of somebody, it's almost impossible at times to know whether they're being morally honest or merely prudent. And here's the example that Kant uses. I think is a brilliant example. Imagine that there's a shopkeeper. I'm saying a grocer, but it could be anybody. It could be a shopkeeper of any kind. And this person is, or he says a grocer, who does not overcharge his inexperienced customer. So you could even send a child who doesn't know how to count with money to buy a loaf of bread, and this grocer will not overcharge the child. Could easily do so, but doesn't. So the shopkeeper refrains from robbing people, right, by shortchanging them, and is always making the correct change, and is therefore apparently honest. But Kant says that's not necessarily honest. It looks like people are being served honestly, but we don't know what the motive of that grocer is. Maybe the motive of that grocekeeper is prudence rather than honesty. In other words, the grocer could be behaving honestly, but it's really not out of honesty. It's out of self-interest, because the grocer knows it would be bad for business if they got caught cheating people, right? If you get caught shortchanging people, what's going to happen? You're going to get a bad reputation. And so it's going to be bad for business. Is that clear? Sure, it's clear. So in this case, the grocer is being prudent, but isn't necessarily honest. So we could easily confuse the two, but it's almost impossible at times to observe someone's behavior and really understand what the motive is. Whether the motive is truly that they adhere to a principle of honesty, such that they will never cheat anybody because they're fundamentally honest and their goodwill. That would be a Kantian principle. Yes, I never cheat anybody because I have goodwill. And it would be wrong to do so. So I have goodwill to my customers. I don't cheat them. Or I merely want business. So I know if I treat you fairly, you'll come back. I'm not doing it because I'm honest. I'm doing it because I'm prudent. Not necessarily greedy. I just want to get more business. Okay. So I'm prudent. Is that clear? Everybody's saying yes so far. That's a good thing. So what Kant really wants is naturally he would prefer that we be honest, but he's saying, people will sometimes be prudent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're honest. Okay, not necessarily. And one of my favorite examples of this, I'll tell you a true story. It's one of my favorite examples of this difference between prudence and honesty, or candor and honesty. It was on the evening news. This goes back 20 years. I was watching the evening news one night, And there was a story on the news, true story on the news, about a cop who they were undercover cops, and they busted a drug dealer. And while the cops were upstairs, doing the bust of the scene, this other cop was searching the car. They had a warrant to search the car as well. And he found a bag in the trunk of the car with like $60,000 in cash, just a bag, duffel bag with $60,000. And the cop turned the money in. They made the arrest, they did all the stuff, and he brought the money and he turned it in. And they thought this was incredible. This was a time when I think there was a lot of corruption in New York City police, or in some certain precincts. And so this cop turned in the $60,000, and the mayor gave him a medal for integrity. And that was on the evening news. This cop gets a medal for integrity because he handed in the $60,000. You could easily pocket it. The drug dealer couldn't have complained, right? What was the drug dealer going to say? The cop robbed me of $60,000. Then the drug dealer would have to explain how he got the $60,000. So he'd be incriminating himself because he didn't earn it honestly. So he had to keep his mouth shut. The cop could have put the money in his pocket. So they asked this cop, and they said, this was the reporter who said, "What was going through your mind?" They put a microphone in his face, and they said, "What was going through your mind when you turned in the money?" And the cop said, he said, "I thought about," he said, "certainly I thought about, not turning it in." He said, I could have just walked away with it in my pocket. He said, "But he said, I thought about it, but I didn't do it because my pension," he said, if I put in my full time on the force, he said, it wasn't worth risking it. My pension is going to be like $1 million or $2 million by the time I retire. Why would I risk my pension for $60,000? That's what the cop said. And the mayor gave him a medal for integrity. Yes, LOL is right. You should be laughing, but tragically, it means that nobody on the police force or the mayor's office involved in the scene had ever taken philosophy 10200, because then they would know the difference between candor and integrity. What the cop was really saying, that's what I heard, and from the whole scene, it was clear the cop was really saying if there had been enough money in there, he might have considered taking it, because then if it was enough, to cover his pension, then maybe, or more, or double his pension, then he might have been tempted to take it, right? He was saying there wasn't enough there to risk his pension for. So he was thinking for himself more than just doing the good thing. Exactly, Aisha. What he was doing was he was acting prudently, but not necessarily honestly. Yes, that's another instance of prudence. And in admitting it's prudence plus candor. He was saying, not only did I think that, but I'm also telling you the honest truth about what I was thinking. So he's candid. So I said, my response was, the mayor should definitely have given him a medal for candor or a medal for prudence, but not a medal for integrity. Integrity is another word which implies wholeness. An integer is a whole number. And if you're a person of integrity, you're a person of moral wholeness. And it means that, this wholeness is not going to be divided by temptation in some way. What the cop was really saying is, had there been enough money there, I would have been tempted to take it. But it wasn't enough compared to my pension to make me consider taking the risk. That's prudence. Okay. Not honesty, certainly. Okay. Not integrity. So in other words, the idea is that the cop was saying everybody has a price, maybe everybody has a price. You want to think about this. It's a moral question for you. Do you have a price? Do you have is there a certain price at which you would sell out your principles? We all have principles, hopefully, but the question is whether your principles at some point can be compromised. All right. Kant is saying that we must never be compromised in our principles, because then our will changes from goodwill to bad will. If we allow our principles to be compromised by circumstance, then we're not going to be good anymore, according to his view. All right. So that's some interesting stuff. Let's go back now to Kant. I want to get to the articulation of this. It's very important now that we do this and articulate his categorical imperative. So we have a duty also to assure our happiness, by the way. And so he's not different from Aristotle in that regard. He thinks happiness is indeed something that we have a duty to strive for, but he thinks the way that we get to it is through the categorical imperative. And this is in this chapter where he formulates it. Note this very important passage: everything in nature works in accordance with laws. By the end of the 18th century, Kant we had seen Newton, we'd seen Boyle, we'd seen all these laws in physics and chemistry. And it had occurred to people, and this is part of the Enlightenment project, that the universe appears to be a lawful place, that there are natural laws by which the phenomena of nature are governed. Biology had not at that time made so much progress. That would come later. But physics and chemistry had made a lot of progress, and mathematics. So it was very clear that there were natural laws. And so Kant could say everything in nature works in accordance with laws. And he, moreover, says only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with his idea of laws. So the laws of nature and the laws of humanity are different, because the laws of nature are sort of given in the fabric of nature, whether God put them there or somehow they got there, but they're already built into the fabric of nature. But a rational being has ideas of laws, and we have to basically act in accordance with them. That is, in accordance with principles, and that's why we have a will, interestingly enough. Since reason is required in order to derive actions from laws, in order to determine how we should act in a certain situation, the will is nothing but practical reason. So for Kant, the will is actually a form of rationality, but it's that part of our rationality which is not abstract, but rather that part of our rationality that dictates our actions. Okay, practical reason. The will is a power to choose only that which reason, independently of inclination, recognizes to be practically necessary, that is, to be good. Very important phrase, independently of inclination. Again, this will take issue with Hobbes and also with Hume, because Hobbes is going to tell us that we act only in terms of our inclination. We're totally motivated by our appetites and aversions, right? And Hume is going to say our oughts are totally subjective and can't be derived from any is. So this is the beginning of the refutation of those moral positions, that in fact the reason is capable of working independently of inclination. We can be objective, in other words. We're not necessarily condemned to be subjective all the time. If our wills are strong enough, certainly, and our reason is just enough, that is valid enough in its operations, then we will be able to choose and to act independently of inclination. This is Kant's part of Kant's argument for the ability of reason to triumph over emotion and subjectivity. So a categorical imperative, and this is in general, he's not telling us what it is yet, but he's saying what it would do, what job it would do. A categorical imperative would be one which represented an action that's objectively necessary. Okay, objectively necessary. That's again going to refute both Hobbes and Hume, and remove ethics from it where it's mired in those subjective grounds. Is going to say no. Categorical imperative can represent an action as objectively necessary and in itself apart from its relation to a further end. In other words, it's not going to be focused on consequences either. It's going to be objectively necessary as a law of reason, and have nothing to do with our subjective inclinations, which may pull us in a different direction, and have nothing to do with our anticipation of consequences, which may indeed pull us also in a different direction. So we're going to be very faithful to and uphold our duty to our reason and our ability to act in accordance with reason. And therefore our goodwill will give rise to actions that would be right. Okay, this is a long chain of reasoning, and you'll want to read this over so you can connect the dots for yourselves. And a categorical imperative declares an action, he repeats this for emphasis, to be objectively necessary in itself, okay, without reference to some purpose. He's just reinforcing that. That is, even without any further end. And such an imperative ranks as an apodeictic practical principle. That means sometimes spelled without the I. It could be apodictic or apodeictic. This means incontrovertible, irrefutable. Okay, so a categorical imperative, it cannot be refuted by any logic. It's absolutely going to withstand all logical criticism. So, and then he's going to tell us what his categorical imperative is. And he says there's only one. I'm going to skip to it. To spare you any further suspense, I want you to read his run-up to it as best you can. But then he concludes that there's only one. And he would formulate it grammatically in a few different ways. But here's the main formulation of his categorical imperative. And this is the meta rule, which we use to determine whether we ought to follow any other moral rule that comes up. Okay? Act only on that maxim. Again, a maxim is a principle. Yeah? Act only on that maxim or rule or a principle. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Or said a different way, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. And what? And what he's asking us to do is to conduct a thought experiment and imagine a world in which the rule that governs what you're about to do were a universal law. You see, he's taking, if you want a more sophisticated view of this, or a richer view of this, he's really taking Newton's laws and he's saying, you know, we can imagine a universe in which we know now that there are physical laws, you know, thanks to Newton and others. We know there are laws of gravitation. We know, you know, all these laws are in force everywhere and can't be violated. They're incontrovertible. He didn't know about special relativity and quantum physics, but in the main world we live in, it's a Newtonian world, and those laws are in play and can't be controverted. So he says, imagine we're living in a world in which what you will to do, okay, that the thing that you will to do itself becomes a universal law. And what kind of a world would that be? And if the law self-destructs, what he's telling us is if the law ends up contradicting itself when it becomes a universal law, then you may not do this. Then you may not do this thing. Okay? You can only do something if it will not contradict itself in a hypothetical world in which it becomes a universal law. So he's able to derive an ought. He's able to derive ought not quite from is, but from hypothetically what is. It's a really clever argument. I have to give you an example. I'm sure some of you now are thoroughly lost in what Kant is trying to tell us. You may be seeing this for the first time, and that's as it ought to be as well. But let's take a very quick and clear example of this before going on next day to Kant's 4 examples. I'll give you a couple. Suppose you're in a situation where you think, you know, I should tell a lie. I'm in some kind of trouble, right? And I ought to tell a lie because a lie is going to be the easiest way to get me out of trouble. Have any of you ever been in a situation where maybe you were tempted to tell a lie? You could be honest with me. I'm not going to report you. Or, you know, but sure, some of you are, oh, it's already a flood of people forthcoming. Hell yes. Okay. Yes. All right. And me too. We've all been in situations, right, where sure, we think, yeah, well, you know, maybe I should just tell a lie and that'll be the easiest way, right? Okay. So you all get this. Perfect. So now what Kant is saying, if you want to really be a moral person, you can't just tell a lie. You have to apply the test of the categorical imperative first. So you have to ask yourself a question. If I'm about to act on a maxim, the maxim being, if I'm in a tough spot, can I lie to get out of it, right? Can you will that to be a universal law? So understand how this works. If you're about to tell a lie, even just a one-time lie, you now have to put yourself in Kant's thought experiment. So imagine you're now inhabiting a universe in which your maxim, in other words, that I'm allowed to tell a lie, if you allow that to become a universal law. So now imagine a world in which everybody has to lie all the time. That's what it would be, right? If there were a universal law of lying, it would mean everybody was lying all the time. And then you ask yourself, would that work in practice? You know, in this hypothetical world, would the maxim actually work or would the maxim self-destruct? Well, I'm asking you the question. Imagine a world in which everyone's lying all the time. Okay? Because that's the universal law, right? That we're all going to lie all the time. So would you be able to lie in such a world? If it were a law that everybody was lying all the time, would a lie work or not? You're all thinking, good. Imagine a world in which, no, not really. That's right, Steen. No, it wouldn't work. Why wouldn't it work? You're all beginning to say, no, it wouldn't work. Why wouldn't it work? You're right. Of course it wouldn't work. In a world in which everyone was lying all the time, of course a lie wouldn't work. And why wouldn't it work? Right, because everybody knows that everybody's lying, right? That's the whole point, that we all know that it's a universal law and everyone's lying. That's right. You're also like, that's the reality. So you would already know that everybody's lying, and so you would never believe anything anybody says. And so it would do you no good to lie. And so in that hypothetical world, the maxim self-destructs. A world in which it's a universal law to lie is a world in which the whole principle of lying falls apart and the lie doesn't work anymore. So the maxim contradicts itself in practice. And as a logical exercise in this hypothetical world, this imaginary world, this universe where there's a law to lie, it falls apart, doesn't work. And therefore, Kant says that lying is wrong because it does not pass the test of the categorical imperative. And therefore, Kant says you always have to tell the truth. And you notice something interesting immediately is that this is not a symmetric situation, because if you now imagine a universe in which the principle of truth-telling is a universal law, it doesn't contradict itself. We can all imagine a universe in which everyone's going around telling the truth, and everybody believes everybody because they know it's a universal law to tell the truth, and there's no logical contradiction in that. And so Kant says, well, there you go. So we're not allowed to lie, but in fact, we're obliged to tell the truth. This is very clever because it removes the whole argument about truth-telling and lying from what we ought or ought not to do, but only from what follows logically from this thought experiment. I hope you're beginning to see the brilliance of this attempted solution. Let me give you another quick example, okay? Suppose we're considering theft as an option. Suppose you're tempted to take something that doesn't belong to you, like that cop, who found the drug money, or, shoplift or whatever. Suppose you're in a scenario where you're tempted to take something that doesn't belong to you. So Kant would say, okay, apply the categorical imperative. Imagine a universe in which now it's a universal law that everybody has to steal, right? That's what you're about to do. Imagine it as a universal law. So everybody has to steal. So everything is actually stolen in such a world because everybody is stealing always everything. So would that work? Would such a universe work? Would the maxim contradict itself? In a universe where everyone is stealing all the time, and you're right that it wouldn't work, Hillary Lenise, you're right, but why wouldn't it work? Why would it contradict itself? In a universe where theft is a universal law, how does that maxim contradict itself? You're right that it does. It doesn't work.
Say that like there'll be no property ownership. Yeah,
excellent.
No one will own anything.
Excellent. Whoever said that? Who said that?
Iris.
Excellent. Oh, you're really on the ball this morning. Good for you. It's exactly right. It contradicts itself logically, as Joseph said, everything is stolen. That's right. But if everything is already stolen, then theft is impossible, because theft means taking something that doesn't belong to you, right? But if everything is stolen in such a universe, nothing belongs to anybody. So you can't steal. So you're contradicting the universal law, because if everything is stolen, then stealing is meaningless. And therefore, a universe in which there's a law that says everybody has to steal, that maxim contradicts itself. And so Kant would say, this taking something that doesn't belong to you cannot pass the test of the categorical imperative, and therefore you mustn't steal. Okay? Do you see the brilliance of this? How he's able, through his rational argument, to transpose the moral question out of Hobbesian likes and dislikes and out of the reach of Hume's guillotine, and locate it in a situation in which rationality is operative. We can think logically about these hypothetical worlds. Okay, one more example. What about adultery? Okay, let's say a world where people are committing, or someone's thinking in our world about committing adultery, and they put it to the test of Kant's categorical imperative. So we would now imagine a universe in which everyone's committing adultery all the time, right? Would it pass that test? If it were a universal law that everybody had to commit adultery, would it work or not? That could work? Well, you're an optimist. I don't think it would work. Right, Iris, for the same reason. Brandon, for the same reason. Yeah, it won't work, because in a universe where everyone is committing adultery all the time, then there's no such thing as marriage. I mean, in a certain sense, marriage becomes meaningless, but adultery by definition means, cheating in some sense outside your marriage. So if you imagine a world, a universe in which adultery is the law, then it negates the possibility of marriage, and therefore it negates the possibility of adultery. So it contradicts itself again. Yeah, we have open marriages, but then that's a different thing. Okay. In Kant's time, there was no such thing. And so a law of the universe that said that everybody has to commit adultery is a law in which the maxim would self-destruct. And so Kant says, therefore, it's wrong. And you can't do it. Okay, those are 3 examples. So I just want you to get the main point. We're out of time for today, but we've covered this important point of the categorical imperative. So this, you see, is a meta rule, because any moral rule, yeah, you can't do it, Ahmed. You like that pun, don't you? I'll probably see it in your essay too. Okay, but here's the thing: that if you're contemplating doing an action, you want to know if that act is right or wrong. Yeah, if you're contemplating an action and you want to make a moral assessment of it, you put it to the test of the categorical imperative, and you ask yourself, in a hypothetical world in which the principle behind that action were a universal law, would in fact that would that maxim self-destruct? And if it would self-destruct, then you mayn't do it. Then it's an immoral act. If it would be perfectly consistent in a universe where it were a universal law, then indeed, on Kant's theory, it would be morally right. And not only morally right, but necessary, right? It's absolutely necessary to follow the categorical imperative. Whenever a moral rule passes that test, we're obliged out of duty to reason and goodwill to follow that. So it means that Kant is always going to tell the truth. Kant is always going to be honest, and so forth. All right. So that basically covers the first part. And then in your breakout sessions, ours and your other breakout sessions, I imagine that you're going to look at Kant's own examples. He goes on to give 4 examples. And then we'll look at his second formulation, because there's a very important alternative way of interpreting this categorical imperative, which is not only about ourselves, but also has to do with our conduct toward other people. And that you will be looking at on Thursday, and you with your respective instructors. Okay. So I wish you all a very good day, and please digest this. Kant is not easy to read, but at times it's very clear. Yeah. If you read all of his arguments, you may get mired and bogged down in certain details. His writing is not always crystal clear. But I think you got the main points. I see from your responses today that you're really with it as far as the main points are concerned. So good for you. And I'll look forward to seeing some of you on Thursday, and the rest of you next Monday when we look at John Stuart Mill. And that will be our last reading of this section. So keep up the good work, keep up the reading and the thinking. Okay. Have a wonderful week, everybody. And I will look forward to seeing you again soon. All right.
Thank
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. Take care, everyone. And we'll see you again soon.